When the HOA slapped me with a $70,000 fine, they didn't know I held the key to their gated paradise, the only road in. The letter arrived on a crisp autumn morning, its crisp white envelope emblazoned with the pristine logo of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. David Hartley, a 38-year-old software engineer with a penchant for solitude, slit it open with a butter knife, expecting another mundane update about community barbecues or landscaping rules. Instead, his eyes widened as he scanned the contents. A fine of $70,000 for non-compliance with HOA regulations. The violations listed were absurd. His mailbox was half an inch too tall, his lawn had unauthorized wildflowers, and his vintage pickup truck, parked in his own driveway, was deemed an eyesore. David's jaw tightened. He'd moved to Willow Creek, a gated community on the outskirts of town, for its quiet charm, not to be micromanaged by a board of self-important neighbors. Willow Creek was a picture-perfect enclave of manicured lawns, identical beige houses, and nosy residents who seemed to live for HOA meetings. David, however, was an outlier. His modest two-story home, inherited from his eccentric grandfather, sat at the edge of the neighborhood, surrounded by a wildflower garden that defied the HOA's obsession with uniformity. He'd never cared for their rules, and they'd never cared for him, until now. The letter demanded payment within 30 days or threatened legal action, including a lien on his property. David tossed the letter onto his cluttered kitchen table, muttering, "They've got to be kidding." He wasn't one to back down from a fight, though. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, David had learned to stand his ground, whether it was against bullies or bureaucrats. He grabbed his laptop and began researching the HOA's bylaws, scouring every clause for loopholes. Hours passed, and his frustration grew. The HOA's rules were airtight, written by lawyers who seemed to anticipate every possible rebellion. But then, buried in a forgotten folder of his grandfather's old documents, he found something that made his heart race: a faded property deed from 1978. The deed wasn't for his house. It was for a narrow, winding strip of land that served as the only road leading into Willow Creek. His grandfather, a shrewd man with a knack for real estate, had purchased the access road decades ago when the neighborhood was just a developer's dream. The HOA, in their haste to build their suburban utopia, had never bothered to acquire it. David's grandfather had leased the road to the community for a nominal fee, a deal that had been forgotten over time. Now, David owned that road outright. A slow grin spread across his face. The HOA had no idea what they'd just stepped into. He spent the next few days digging deeper, consulting a lawyer friend, Sarah, who confirmed the deed's validity. "David, this is gold," she said, her eyes gleaming over coffee. "They can't access their precious neighborhood without your road. You've got leverage." David nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. He wasn't just going to fight the fine, he was going to turn the tables on the HOA. But first, he needed to understand his enemy. The Willow Creek HOA was led by Margaret Voss, a retired accountant with a reputation for ruling the neighborhood like a dictator. Her allies on the board, Tom Reynolds, a pompous real estate agent, and Linda Harper, a busybody who patrolled the streets with a clipboard, were equally insufferable. They enforced rules with zeal, fining residents for everything from unapproved paint colors to leaving Christmas lights up past January. David had mostly avoided their wrath by keeping to himself, but his wildflower garden and old truck had apparently pushed them over the edge. He decided to attend the next HOA meeting, a rare move for him. The community center was packed with residents, most of whom looked bored or intimidated. Margaret stood at the podium, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk. When David's turn came to speak, he stood calmly, holding the letter. "I received a $70,000 fine for my mailbox and flowers," he said, his voice steady. "Care to explain?" The room buzzed with whispers. Margaret's lips pursed. "Rules are rules, Mr. Hartley," she said. "Your property is a blight on our community's standards." David didn't argue. He just smiled and sat down, letting Margaret think she'd won. Back home, he began drafting a plan. The deed gave him control over the road, but using it as a weapon required strategy. He could block access, but that would alienate his neighbors, many of whom were just as frustrated with the HOA as he was. Instead, he decided to play a longer game. He'd comply with the HOA's demands. On the surface, while quietly preparing to expose their overreach. Over the next week, David measured his mailbox, trimmed his wildflowers, and even parked his truck in the garage. He sent a polite email to the HOA, promising to address the violations. Margaret responded with a smug note, reminding him that the fine still stood. David didn't care. He was biding his time, gathering allies among the neighbors. He started with Mrs. Alvarez, a kind retiree who'd been fined for her grandson's basketball hoop. "They're bullies," she whispered over tea. "Count me in." Others followed. Jake, a young mechanic fed up with parking restrictions, and Priya, a single mom tired of being nickel-and-dimed for minor infractions. By the end of the week, David had a small but loyal group of supporters. He shared the deed with them, watching their eyes light up as they realized the power he held. "We can't just block the road," he told them. "We need to make the HOA beg for it." The group agreed to keep the deed a secret for now, letting the HOA think they had the upper hand. David's plan was simple. Let the HOA escalate their demands, then hit them with the truth about the road at the perfect moment. As the 30-day deadline approached, the HOA sent another letter, this time threatening to seize his home if the fine wasn't paid. David's blood boiled, but he stayed calm. He had the deed, the law, and a growing army of fed-up neighbors. The HOA thought they were in control, but they were about to learn who really held the keys to Willow Creek. David spent the next few days fortifying his position. His lawyer friend, Sarah, helped him draft a formal response to the HOA's latest threat, a carefully worded letter that neither admitted fault nor paid the fine. Instead, it requested a detailed breakdown of the $70,000, citing concerns about transparency. David knew the HOA wouldn't expect pushback. Most residents caved under their pressure. He mailed the letter certified, ensuring Margaret and her cronies couldn't ignore it. Meanwhile, he began researching the road's history. His grandfather's old files revealed that the developer of Willow Creek had gone bankrupt in the 1980s, leaving the road's ownership in limbo until his grandfather snapped it up for a bargain. The HOA had assumed the road was public property, a mistake that had gone unnoticed for decades. David hired a surveyor to confirm the boundaries, and the results were even better than he'd hoped. The road extended beyond the main entrance, encompassing a small bridge over a creek that every resident crossed to enter or leave the neighborhood. Without access to that bridge, Willow Creek was effectively cut off from the outside world. David's next move was to test the HOA's resolve. He installed a temporary gate at the edge of his property, where the road began. It wasn't locked, just a metal bar with a sign reading "Private Property, Access by Permission Only." He didn't block anyone, but the gate's presence sent a message. Neighbors noticed immediately, and word spread like wildfire. At the next HOA meeting, Margaret was livid. "Mr. Hartley, remove that gate at once," she demanded, her voice trembling with indignation. "It's a safety hazard and a violation of community standards." David leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "It's on my property," he said calmly. "I checked the deed." "Did you?" The room fell silent. Margaret's face reddened, but she quickly changed the subject, promising to address the issue legally. David knew she was bluffing. She'd have to prove the HOA owned the road, which they didn't. After the meeting, several neighbors approached him, curious and emboldened. "Is it true you own the road?" Jake whispered. David just winked. "Wait and see." Back home, David and his allies brainstormed their next steps. Priya suggested rallying more residents by exposing the HOA's overreach. "People are scared," she said. "If we show them you've got real power, they'll join us." David agreed. He printed flyers detailing the HOA's excessive fines and distributed them discreetly, avoiding Margaret's spies. The flyers didn't mention the road yet. That bombshell would come later. Instead, they listed grievances: $500 for unapproved porch furniture, $1,000 for a fence painted the wrong shade of white, $200 for a child's lemonade stand. The neighborhood was buzzing with discontent by the end of the week. Margaret and the HOA board responded with a new tactic: intimidation. They sent inspectors to David's property daily, photographing his mailbox, measuring his grass, and even citing him for a suspiciously placed garden gnome. Each citation added to the fine, pushing it to $75,000. David laughed when he saw the latest notice. "They're desperate," he told Sarah over the phone. "They're trying to bury me in paperwork." Sarah advised him to stay calm and document everything. They're building a case, but so are you, she said. Keep the road card close. David's allies grew bolder. Mrs. Alvarez organized a secret meeting at her house, where a dozen residents shared their own HOA horror stories. One man had been fined for planting a vegetable garden. Another had been forced to repaint his garage door twice to match the approved shade. The group agreed to form a coalition, with David as their unofficial leader. They called themselves the Willow Creek Resistance, a tongue-in-cheek nod to their underdog status. David shared the deed with the group, and their excitement was palpable. "We can shut them down," Jake said, grinning. "Not yet," David cautioned. "We need to catch them off guard." The opportunity came sooner than expected. The HOA announced a special assessment to fund community improvements, demanding $2,000 from every homeowner. The timing was suspicious. It felt like a direct attack on David's growing rebellion. Residents were furious, but most were too afraid to speak out. David saw his chance. He called a meeting of the resistance and laid out his plan. He'd give the HOA one last chance to drop the fine and reform their rules. If they refused, he'd reveal the deed and threaten to close the road. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Margaret opened with a smug announcement about the assessment, claiming it was for essential infrastructure. David stood, holding a copy of the deed. "Before we discuss new fees," he said, his voice clear, "I'd like to address my $75,000 fine." He held up the deed, letting the room absorb the moment. "This is the title to the access road, the only way in or out of Willow Creek. It's mine, and I'm done playing nice." The room erupted. Margaret tried to regain control, shouting about legal recourse, but David pressed on. "Drop the fine, cancel the assessment, and rewrite your rules to stop bullying residents," he said. "Or I lock the gate." For the first time, Margaret looked rattled. She adjourned the meeting abruptly, promising to review the matter. David knew she'd come after him harder now, but he was ready. The HOA had no idea the storm they'd unleashed. The days following David's bombshell were chaotic. Margaret and the HOA board launched a full-scale offensive, hiring a lawyer to challenge the deed's validity. They sent cease and desist letters, accusing David of interfering with community access. Residents were divided. Some saw David as a hero, others as a troublemaker threatening their daily commute. Margaret capitalized on the fear, spreading rumors that David planned to charge tolls or sell the road to developers. David countered with a website, hosted on his own server, detailing the HOA's abuses and clarifying his intentions. He just wanted fairness. Sarah helped him navigate the legal threats, confirming that the deed was ironclad. The HOA's lawyer, a slick attorney named Gregory Wells, demanded a meeting. David agreed, but only on his terms. At his house, with his allies present, Wells arrived with Margaret and Tom, looking smug in his tailored suit. "Mr. Hartley," he began, "your claim to the road is questionable at best. We'll bury you in court." David leaned forward, unfazed. "You're welcome to try," he said. "But every resident will be trapped here while you do. Good luck explaining that." Margaret's composure cracked. "This is extortion," she spat. David shrugged. "You fined me $75,000 for flowers. Call it even." Wells promised a lawsuit, but David sensed their desperation. They couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle. Residents were already refusing to pay the special assessment, citing David's revelations. The resistance had grown to 30 households, nearly half the neighborhood, and they were ready to back him. David's next move was bold. He installed a lock on the gate. He didn't close it yet, but the message was clear. Residents could still come and go, but the lock was a constant reminder of his power. The HOA retaliated by filing an emergency injunction, claiming the road was a public easement. Sarah laughed when she saw the filing. "They're grasping at straws," she said. "There's no easement recorded anywhere." The court denied the injunction, citing insufficient evidence. David celebrated quietly with his allies, but he knew the war wasn't over. Margaret tried a new tactic, divide and conquer. She offered to waive fines for any resident who publicly denounced David. A few caved, but most held firm, especially after David promised not to block the road unless absolutely necessary. He organized a community barbecue on his property, inviting everyone to see the wildflowers the HOA hated so much. The event was a hit. Kids played in the garden, neighbors swapped stories, and even some of Margaret's loyalists softened. David used the opportunity to distribute a petition demanding the HOA's dissolution. Over 60% of residents signed it. The final showdown came at a special HOA meeting called to address the road crisis. Margaret presented a compromise. They'd reduce David's fine to $10,000 if he relinquished the road to the HOA. David stood, holding the petition. "Here's my counteroffer," he said. "Dissolve the HOA, refund all fines, and elect a new board that actually listens to residents. Or I lock the gate tomorrow." The room exploded in cheers and arguments. Margaret tried to gavel for order, but it was too late. The petition circulated, and residents demanded a vote. In a stunning upset, the HOA was dissolved by a narrow margin. Margaret resigned in disgrace, and a new board was formed, with David and Priya among its members. The fines were canceled, and David agreed to lease the road to the community for $1 a year, ensuring access for all. As he drove home that night, his wildflowers glowing under the moonlight, David felt a weight lift. The HOA had tried to crush him, but he'd turned their own rules against them. Willow Creek was free, and he still owned the road. The dissolution of the Willow Creek HOA sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, but David Hartley knew the victory was only the beginning. The new board, with David, Priya, and Mrs. Alvarez at the helm, promised transparency and fairness, but not everyone was ready to embrace change. Margaret Voss, though stripped of her title, hadn't left quietly. She'd retreated to her pristine beige mansion, rallying her loyalists, mostly older residents who feared losing the neighborhood's prestige without her iron grip. Whispers of a counter-rebellion spread, and David sensed trouble brewing. The new board's first meeting was held in the community center, a stark contrast to the tense gatherings under Margaret's rule. David proposed simple rules: no fines for personal expression, like wildflower gardens or unique mailboxes, and a cap on fees for community upkeep. Priya suggested a resident-led committee to oversee projects, ensuring no one felt dictated to. The room, filled with hopeful neighbors, applauded, but a small group in the back, led by Tom Reynolds, Margaret's former deputy, sat stone-faced. David noted their glares but pressed on, outlining plans to repair the aging community pool without exorbitant assessments. After the meeting, Jake, the mechanic who'd joined the resistance, pulled David aside. "Tom's been meeting with Margaret," he said, glancing around. "They're telling people you're going to turn the road into a toll booth." David frowned. He'd leased the road to the community for $1 a year to avoid such accusations, but Margaret's smear campaign was gaining traction. He needed to solidify his position before her allies could undermine the new board. David's lawyer, Sarah, suggested a public gesture to win over skeptics. "Show them you're not the villain," she said over coffee. "Fix something the HOA neglected, something visible." David thought of the crumbling bridge on his road, a sore spot for residents who complained about its potholes. He hired a contractor, using his own savings to fund repairs, and posted updates on the Resistance's website. The project wasn't cheap, $15,000, but it was a small price to pay for goodwill. Residents watched as the bridge transformed, its new surface smooth and safe. Even some of Margaret's supporters grudgingly admitted it was an improvement. But Margaret wasn't done. She filed a petition with the county, claiming David's road ownership was a public nuisance and demanding it be seized under eminent domain. The move was audacious, but Sarah assured David it wouldn't hold up. The county had no grounds to take private property without overwhelming public need. Still, the petition stirred fear among residents, who worried about losing access to their homes. David countered with a town hall, inviting everyone to see the deed and hear his side. "I'm not here to trap anyone," he said, standing before a packed room. "I fought the HOA to protect us, not to hold you hostage." He shared the lease agreement, emphasizing its $1 annual fee. The crowd softened, but Tom stood up, accusing David of grandstanding. The tension was palpable. David's allies rallied. Priya organized a door-to-door campaign, explaining the deed's history and David's intentions. Mrs. Alvarez baked cookies for skeptical neighbors, charming them with stories of her own battles against the old HOA. Slowly, the tide turned. The county rejected Margaret's petition, citing insufficient evidence, and David's bridge repairs were completed just in time for a community picnic he hosted on his property. The event drew nearly every resident, with kids playing among the wildflowers and adults sharing ideas for a better Willow Creek. For the first time, David felt the neighborhood was truly united. But late that night, as he locked his gate, a habit he'd kept for security, he noticed a figure lurking near the road. It was too dark to see clearly, but the silhouette vanished into the trees. David's gut told him Margaret's group was planning something. He called Sarah the next morning, asking her to dig into Tom's real estate dealings. If Margaret was plotting, David wanted to know her next move before she made it. The figure in the shadows proved to be more than a paranoid hunch. 2 days after the picnic, David woke to find the new bridge defaced with spray paint. Hartley's Toll Road, in bold red letters. Worse, the gate's lock was jammed with glue, rendering it useless. David's blood boiled, but he stayed calm, documenting the damage with photos. He called the police, who took a report, but warned that catching the culprit without witnesses would be tough. Jake, who'd stopped by to help clean the graffiti, muttered, "This has Margaret written all over it." David agreed. The vandalism wasn't just petty, it was a calculated move to turn residents against him. Social media buzzed with posts from anonymous accounts, likely Margaret's allies, claiming David's road ownership was a threat to community safety. Some residents, still wary from the eminent domain scare, started to waver. David knew he had to act fast to keep the neighborhood on his side. He called an emergency board meeting, where Priya suggested installing security cameras along the road. "If they strike again, we'll catch them," she said. David funded the cameras himself, placing them discreetly at the bridge and gate. He also hired a private investigator, recommended by Sarah, to track Margaret's and Tom's activities. The investigator, a gruff ex-cop named Mike, uncovered a lead. Tom had been meeting with a developer interested in buying land adjacent to Willow Creek. The deal hinged on securing road access, David's road. The revelation hit David like a thunderbolt. Margaret and Tom weren't just trying to discredit him. They wanted to force him to sell the road for their own profit. Sarah confirmed that Tom's real estate firm had a history of shady deals, including pressuring homeowners to sell at below-market rates. "They're playing dirty," she said, "but we can play smarter." David's next move was to strengthen his alliances. He met with the new board and key resistance members, sharing the investigators' findings. They agreed to expose Tom's scheme at the next community meeting, but needed hard evidence. Mike kept digging, tailing Tom to a meeting with the developer at a local diner. He overheard enough to confirm the plan. Tom would convince the county to revisit the eminent domain claim, using the vandalism as proof that David's ownership was destabilizing the community. Margaret, meanwhile, was funding the campaign with her savings, hoping to regain control. David decided to go on the offensive. He invited the developer, a slick businessman named Carl Baxter, to his house under the pretense of discussing the road. With Sarah present, David laid out his terms. He'd never sell, but he'd consider a partnership if the developer backed off and exposed Tom's scheme. Carl, caught off guard, admitted Tom had promised easy access to the road. David recorded the conversation, with Carl's consent, and handed it to Mike for safekeeping. At the community meeting, David played the recording to a stunned audience. Gasps filled the room as Carl's voice described Tom's plan to manipulate the county. Tom tried to deny it, but the evidence was damning. Residents turned on him, demanding his resignation from the board. Margaret, present in the back, stormed out, her face pale. The new board voted unanimously to remove Tom, and the developer withdrew his offer, unwilling to tangle with David's legal team. The vandalism stopped, and the cameras caught no further incidents. David repaired the bridge again, this time with community volunteers pitching in. The neighborhood began to feel like a true community, with residents organizing their own events, a book club, a kids' soccer league, without fear of HOA fines. But David remained vigilant. Margaret was down, but not out, and he knew she'd find another way to strike back. Margaret's silence lasted 2 weeks, just long enough for David to hope she'd given up. Then a new letter arrived, not from the HOA, but from a law firm representing Margaret personally. She was suing David for defamation and emotional distress, claiming his public accusations had ruined her reputation. The lawsuit demanded $100,000 in damages and, more alarmingly, a court order to transfer the road to the county. David's heart sank as he read the filing. This wasn't just revenge. It was a last-ditch effort to seize his leverage. Sarah called an emergency meeting with David and the new board. "This is a scare tactic," she said, flipping through the lawsuit. "Margaret's got no case for defamation. You had evidence against Tom, and she wasn't even named in the recording. But the road transfer is dangerous. If the court buys her public interest argument, you could lose control." David nodded, his mind racing. He'd fought too hard to let Margaret win now. The resistance rallied, pooling resources to cover David's legal fees. Priya launched a social media campaign, #SaveWillowCreek, to drum up public support, framing the lawsuit as a bully's attempt to silence a hero. Local news picked up the story, with a reporter interviewing David about the road's history. "My grandfather bought it to protect this community," he told the camera. "I'm just honoring his legacy." The story went viral, painting Margaret as a petty tyrant. Donations poured in, easing the financial strain. Mike, the investigator, uncovered another piece of the puzzle. Margaret had hired a surveyor to falsify records, claiming the road was originally part of the neighborhood's public infrastructure. The surveyor, a nervous man named Ed, admitted to Sarah under pressure that Margaret had paid him to alter maps. Armed with this, Sarah filed a counterclaim, accusing Margaret of fraud and malicious prosecution. The judge, unimpressed with Margaret's flimsy evidence, dismissed her road transfer request outright. The defamation claim was allowed to proceed, but Sarah was confident it would collapse at trial. David used the publicity to strengthen the community. He proposed a neighborhood charter, drafted by residents, to replace the old HOA bylaws. The charter emphasized freedom and cooperation, with no fines for personal property choices and a transparent budget. At a packed town hall, residents voted overwhelmingly to adopt it, cementing the new board's authority. David also installed a permanent sign at the bridge, Willow Creek Access Road, privately owned, publicly shared. It was a reminder of his victory and his commitment. Margaret's lawsuit dragged on, but her support dwindled. Former allies distanced themselves, and Tom moved away, his real estate business tarnished. David's cameras caught one last act of defiance. A lone figure, likely Margaret, tossing a rock at the gate. It did no damage, and David chose not to pursue it. He had bigger plans, a community garden, funded by donations, where wildflowers like his grandfather's could thrive. With Margaret's lawsuit faltering, Willow Creek entered a new era. David's community garden became the neighborhood's heart, a sprawling patch of wildflowers, vegetables, and fruit trees where residents worked side by side. Kids learned to plant seeds, and retirees shared gardening tips, their laughter echoing across the once quiet streets. David donated a portion of his land for the project, ensuring it was a true community effort. The garden's opening ceremony drew a crowd, with a local band playing and food trucks lining the repaired bridge. Even the county mayor attended, praising David's leadership. But not everyone was content. A small group of Margaret's loyalists, led by Linda Harper, formed a concerned residents group, claiming the new board was too lax. They petitioned for stricter rules, citing declining property values due to the garden's unkempt look. David ignored them, but Linda's group found an ally in a county official, Roger Klein, who owed Margaret a favor. Klein proposed a new ordinance requiring private roads to meet public standards, a thinly veiled attempt to force David to surrender his road or face costly upgrades. Sarah warned David that the ordinance could pass if Klein swayed the county board. "He's got influence," she said. "We need to fight this in public." David organized a rally at the county courthouse, with residents holding signs reading, "Hands off our road." The #SaveWillowCreek campaign went national, trending on X after a viral video showed Mrs. Alvarez, now a local celebrity, calling Klein Margaret's puppet. The pressure worked. Klein's ordinance was voted down, and he retired under scrutiny for unrelated ethics violations. The garden flourished, becoming a symbol of Willow Creek's rebirth. David, Priya, and the board launched a scholarship fund for local kids, using surplus community fees. They also hosted workshops on sustainable living, drawing visitors from neighboring towns. David's wildflowers, once a target of HOA fines, were now a point of pride, featured in a regional gardening magazine. Margaret's lawsuit finally collapsed when her lawyer withdrew, citing irreconcilable differences. She settled out of court, paying David's legal fees to avoid further embarrassment. David used the money to install solar-powered lights along the road, a final touch to his grandfather's legacy. As winter approached, he stood by the bridge, watching snow dust the garden. Willow Creek was his home, and he'd fought to make it a place worth living in. By spring, Willow Creek was unrecognizable from its HOA-controlled past. The community garden bloomed with color, and residents organized their own events, a summer fair, a movie night under the stars, without fear of fines. David's Road, once a point of contention, was now a symbol of freedom, its bridge adorned with a mural painted by local kids. The new board, led by Priya after David stepped back to focus on the garden, maintained the charter's promise of fairness. Assessments were low, projects were resident-approved, and disputes were settled over coffee, not lawsuits. Margaret had moved to a neighboring town, her influence gone. Linda's concerned residents group fizzled out, unable to gain traction against the community's newfound unity. David's role as the road's owner faded into the background, but he kept the deed locked in a safe, just in case. He'd learned never to underestimate the power of bureaucracy or spite. One day, a letter arrived from a lawyer representing his grandfather's estate. It included a journal, written in his grandfather's spidery handwriting, detailing why he'd bought the road. "Control the path, and you control the future," he'd written. "Protect what matters." David smiled, realizing his fight had honored that vision. He shared the journal with the community, inspiring a new generation to value their independence. David's life settled into a quiet rhythm. He worked on his software projects, tended the garden, and mentored kids who showed an interest in coding or planting. Sarah, now a close friend, teased him about running for mayor, but David laughed it off. "I'm just a guy with a road," he said. But to Willow Creek, he was more, a neighbor who'd turned a $70,000 fine into a revolution. On the anniversary of the HOA's dissolution, the community threw a festival on David's property. Residents danced, ate, and toasted to their freedom. As fireworks lit up the sky, David stood by his gate, looking at the road that had changed everything. He'd won, not just for himself, but for everyone who called Willow Creek home. And he knew, deep down, that his grandfather would have been proud. The festival marking the first anniversary of the HOA's dissolution had left Willow Creek buzzing with optimism, but David Hartley knew better than to let his guard down. The community garden flourished, the new charter governed fairly, and the road, his road, stood as a quiet symbol of the neighborhood's freedom. Yet, as spring blossomed into summer, a new threat emerged, one that tested David's resolve and the community's unity in ways even Margaret Voss's schemes never had. It started with an email from a company called Pinnacle Properties, a real estate conglomerate known for snapping up suburban enclaves and turning them into luxury estates. Their message was polite but direct. They wanted to buy David's Road and the adjacent land for a transformative development project that would elevate Willow Creek's value. The offer was staggering, $2 million for the road alone, plus a share of future profits. David read the email twice, his coffee growing cold. The money was tempting, but he knew what development meant. Gated mansions, higher taxes, and the erasure of everything he'd fought for. He shared the email with Priya and Mrs. Alvarez at the community garden, where they were planting sunflowers with a group of kids. "They're circling like vultures," Priya said, wiping dirt from her hands. "We can't let them turn this place into another soulless subdivision." Mrs. Alvarez nodded, her eyes narrowing. "They'll try to divide us, offer money to some, pressure others. We need to stand together." David agreed. He'd seen how developers operated, preying on fractured communities. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and he wasn't about to let an outsider dismantle it. David called Sarah, his lawyer friend, who dug into Pinnacle Properties. She discovered they had a history of aggressive tactics, buying key infrastructure like roads or utilities to strong-arm communities into compliance. "They know you own the road," Sarah said over the phone. "That's why they're starting with a big offer. If you say no, they'll get nasty." David wasn't surprised. He'd faced bullies before, from Margaret's HOA to Tom's shady deals. Pinnacle was just a bigger player with deeper pockets. The company didn't wait long to escalate. A week after the email, a representative named Vanessa Klein arrived in Willow Creek, hosting a glossy presentation at the community center. She promised modern amenities, upgraded infrastructure, and skyrocketing property values if residents supported Pinnacle's plan. Vanessa was charming, her slides filled with images of sleek homes and pristine parks, but David saw through the polish. She avoided mentioning the road, focusing instead on vague benefits. When a resident asked how Pinnacle would access their proposed development, Vanessa smiled tightly and said, "We're in discussions with key stakeholders." David stood up, holding a copy of the deed. "That'd be me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I own the only road in, and it's not for sale." The room buzzed with murmurs. Vanessa's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, promising to work with Mr. Hartley for the community's benefit. After the meeting, several residents approached David, worried about Pinnacle's influence. "They're offering cash to anyone who'll pressure you," Jake whispered. "Some folks are tempted." David nodded. He'd expected this. Divide and conquer was a classic tactic. He called a resistance meeting, now a formal community group, to strategize. Priya suggested a counter-campaign, emphasizing Willow Creek's unique charm, its garden, its freedom, its history. They printed flyers, hosted a town hall, and invited residents to share what they loved about the neighborhood. The event was a success, with stories of kids playing freely, neighbors collaborating, and the garden's role in uniting them. Even Linda Harper, Margaret's former ally, spoke up, admitting she'd misjudged David. "I like my wild roses," she said sheepishly. "The old HOA would have fined me for them." But Pinnacle wasn't deterred. Vanessa returned with a new offer, $3 million and a promise to preserve the community's character. David rejected it, citing his grandfather's journal. Control the path, control the future. He wasn't just protecting a road. He was safeguarding Willow Creek's soul. Pinnacle responded by lobbying the county, proposing a rezoning plan that would classify David's road as a public utility, forcing him to sell or upgrade it at his own expense. Sarah warned that the county board was split, with some officials swayed by Pinnacle's donations. David fought back with facts. He and the resistance gathered data on Pinnacle's past projects. Communities gutted, residents displaced, promises broken. They presented their findings at a county hearing, backed by a petition signed by 80% of Willow Creek's residents. The hashtag Save Willow Creek campaign, revived on X, trended again, drawing support from environmentalists and local activists. A young resident, Mia, created a viral video tour of the garden, narrating how David's stand against the HOA had inspired her to start a beekeeping club. The county board, under public pressure, tabled the rezoning plan. Pinnacle's next move was personal. Vanessa met David privately, offering $5 million and a seat on their advisory board. "You could retire," she said, her voice smooth. David laughed. "I'm not here to cash out. I'm here to keep this place ours." Vanessa's charm vanished. "You'll regret this," she said before leaving. That night, David's security cameras caught two men tampering with the bridge's supports. He called the police, who traced the vandals to a contractor linked to Pinnacle. The evidence was enough to halt Pinnacle's campaign, but David knew they'd try again. He reinforced the bridge and doubled the cameras, determined to protect his road and his community. The vandalism attempt marked a turning point. Pinnacle Properties, facing bad press and a county investigation into their contractor's actions, backed off Willow Creek. Vanessa sent a curt email, withdrawing their offer, but David wasn't naive enough to think the fight was over. Developers like Pinnacle never truly gave up. They'd wait for a new angle, a new weakness. But for now, Willow Creek was safe, and David's road remained the community's lifeline, a symbol of their hard-won independence. The neighborhood leaned into its newfound identity. The community garden expanded, with residents donating tools and seeds to create a second plot for fruit trees. Priya, now board president, launched a mentorship program, pairing teens with professionals like David, who taught coding workshops in the community center. Mrs. Alvarez started a history project, documenting Willow Creek's transformation from HOA tyranny to resident-led harmony. She included David's grandfather's journal, now a cherished artifact, in a small exhibit at the garden's entrance. David, meanwhile, focused on securing the road's future. He worked with Sarah to establish a trust, ensuring that if he ever sold his property, the road would remain accessible to Willow Creek residents under the same $1 a year lease. The trust also protected the garden, designating it as a community asset. At a town hall, David presented the trust to a cheering crowd. "This road isn't just mine," he said. "It's ours. Always will be." Residents stood, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. Even Linda Harper joined in. Her concerned residents group long disbanded. But peace was never permanent. A new challenge emerged when a state senator, lobbied by real estate interests, proposed a bill to simplify eminent domain for critical infrastructure like private roads. The bill was vague, but Sarah flagged it as a potential threat. "It's not aimed at you directly," she said, "but it could give companies like Pinnacle a backdoor to try again." David didn't hesitate. He mobilized the resistance, now a well-oiled machine, to lobby against the bill. They partnered with other communities facing similar threats, forming a statewide coalition called Roads to Freedom. The coalition's campaign was relentless. Residents testified at state hearings, sharing stories of corporate overreach and the importance of local control. David spoke last, holding up his deed. "This road saved my neighborhood," he said. "Don't let a law take that power from others." Mia's beekeeping video, repurposed for the campaign, went viral again, with hashtags like #RoadsToFreedom trending on X. The senator, facing a PR nightmare, withdrew the bill, citing community feedback. Willow Creek celebrated with a garden party, where David was surprised with a plaque naming the bridge Hartley's Crossing. As summer faded into fall, David reflected on his journey. The $70,000 fine that started it all felt like a distant memory, a spark that had ignited a revolution. He'd turned a personal fight into a community triumph, proving that one person, with the right leverage, could change everything. His grandfather's words echoed, "Protect what matters." David had done that, not just for himself, but for every neighbor who now planted flowers without fear, parked their cars freely, or simply enjoyed a sunset by the bridge. One evening, as he walked the garden's paths, a young boy ran up, holding a sunflower. "Mr. Hartley, this is for you," he said. "Thanks for saving our home." David took the flower, his throat tight. He looked out at the road, its lights glowing softly, and knew he'd kept his promise. Willow Creek wasn't just a place. It was a legacy, one he'd defend as long as he held the deed. Years later, when David was old and gray, he'd tell the story of the fine, the road, and the fight that made a community whole. Kids would listen, wide-eyed, as he pointed to Hartley's Crossing, still standing strong. And somewhere, his grandfather was smiling, knowing the path he'd left behind had led to a future worth fighting for.